Thank you. I'm very conscious we are standing between you and the end of the day and perhaps dinner. We're going to make this a lively panel to finish up with. We have, as our MC said, music to interrupt me. We have, as our MC said, a good, great panel here. We're talking about regulatory cooperation for an investable ASEAN. ASEAN's economy at the moment is somewhere close to $3 trillion per year. And ASEAN actually is doing extremely well when it comes to attracting FDI. FDI inflows are at record levels coming into the region at the moment. That said, I think ASEAN is at a bit of a crossroads as we look ahead. And the question really for us to discuss here today is how we can drive more investment into the region to ensure a just and sustainable economic development going forward. Regulatory issues are a concern for many businesses, and we will be discussing that here today. And I think without further ado, we'll jump straight into the questions for my panel. Rupert, I'm going to come to you first, because at ESCAP you've been doing a lot of work in this space and regulatory challenges, both for goods and for services as well. What do you see as some of those key regulatory challenges for investors in ASEAN countries, and how can we look to enhance cooperation going forward?
So actually, whenever you talk about investment-related regulatory issues, there are two parts. One is at the border, and the other is behind the border. The border part is more about the liberalization measures and, what sort of participation is allowed. In that context, ASEAN countries are generally quite liberal, much more advanced than many other developing countries and other sub-regions in the Asia-Pacific. But I would like to focus more on the investment facilitation part, which is the behind the border, the regulatory measures, approaches, the time taken, and so on, which really sometimes can deter investors from the intent to actualize the investment on the ground. So here, I think, again, there is a lot of disparity because this is a diverse grouping of countries. So countries are at very different levels. Some are definitely much more advanced in terms of the facilitation measures. But some of the common problems that arise are, for instance, lack of clarity in terms of the measures and regulations that investors have to follow. Sometimes these could be at the national level, but often they're also at the sub-national and provincial levels. So that's an important aspect. Interagency coordination within countries is an issue, and it's come out in some of our surveys and assessments of the countries and their investment climate. Another is in terms of corruption. That is an issue that sometimes investors have to face. There's the speed, the time, the resources required to actually invest in the country. So again, the regulatory process, the efficiency of it. So there are many, many aspects. And if these are problems at a national level, then talk about the problems when you come across the region. If you're trying to develop a value chain sort of based FDI model where you're going to target certain sectors and try to attract the investments across different parts of the value chain in the different countries, then that becomes a difficult problem because you have to take the regulatory cooperation beyond the countries. In the national level, it's difficult. Then doing interagency and regulatory cooperation across countries is difficult. But I think ASEAN member states are well placed in one aspect, which is that they recognize the significance of this. If you look at the Joint Statement Initiative, the investment facilitation for development in the WTO, most of the ASEAN member states are parties to that agreement, which means they recognize the importance of that. Also within ASEAN, you have the framework for investment facilitation, and there are certain principles there which countries are, they're voluntary principles, they're non-binding, but still the acceptance of those principles is itself a good starting point. Now, how do you promote this? Well, you need actions both at the national level and at the regional level. At the national level, of course, many of the measures that I've mentioned need to be addressed. But at the regional level, I think one of the things is to also look at what are some common sectors where countries could actually play a role and attract, as a region, investment into ASEAN, and then establish where they are placed in terms of that value chain and work accordingly. The second part of it is to also look at complementary issues. And I think investment doesn't go alone. You need also trade facilitation along with that. You need mobility of people. So trade, investment, mobility, many of these areas also have to be looked at for regulatory cooperation. So it's a much larger issue. And then there are many other ways. For instance, capacity building. If there are common challenges, common capacity issues, then can you do that together? This is something that, for instance, ESCAP is looking at. the scale and the scope part of it. So within ASEAN, can you do capacity building? Can you look at the value chain? Can you identify what are the bottlenecks? And then look at complementary policies and regulations, which will also need facilitation.
And you mentioned there that, many ASEAN member states are signatories to WTO agreements. Of course, being a signatory and implementing it is a completely different thing. Could you comment about the implementation element?
So, implementation, it's a challenge. I mean, for instance, many countries are parties to the trade facilitation agreement, but implementing on the ground requires a significant amount of political will and commitment. And down at the ground level, what the officials themselves practice, that may not always translate. So intent is there, but the implementation is not there. And that part of it is a human resource and capacity issue. That's where training and those kinds of capacity building programs and technical assistance play an important role. Part of it is also what sort of processes you use. For instance, digitalization of processes and new mechanisms. A lot of interagency sort of regulatory dialogues and cooperation mechanisms. So there is a lot that countries can also learn from each other. For instance, what is working in other countries in terms of governance mechanisms, impact assessment, right? Digital processes, and if they can transfer some of that to their own countries. I think this is another area where regulatory cooperation can play a very important role.
Thanks. Actually, I'll come to you. I mean, you're operating a business here in Indonesia and in Singapore as well. Can you comment perhaps on some of the regulatory challenges that you face in your sector or more generally?
Sure, I'm happy to. So, just for a little bit of background, the voice that I bring to this panel is really that of an investor, a business operator. We've been operating in Southeast Asia for about 6 years now. We've invested somewhere between 300 to 400 million US dollars to date. That number should be going up closer to $1 billion over the next 4 or 5 years, right? We look at the region very closely. In fact, we operate primarily in Indonesia, but we've studied, evaluated, invested in different parts of ASEAN to not such a high degree as Indonesia, but we've looked at it very closely. I mean, coming to your question, Chris, around the challenges that the region faces, look, I mean, the only way that I need to talk is, I know how to talk is to call a spade, right? And the challenges are not trivial, let's put it that way, right? While ASEAN is clearly, I think, a body which is doing a lot of great work as a geographical union and is increasingly, I think, starting to speak with one voice. I think when it comes to regulatory harmonization, I think there's a lot of work to be done. I think it's very important to accept as a starting point that these are countries in ASEAN with very different ethno-linguistic histories, very different legacy baggage from colonialism, right? Even inside ASEAN, right? You have different forms of or countries with very different legal systems that colonize different parts of ASEAN. And today, I think a lot of ASEAN countries are still working under the weight of that baggage, right? And still trying to find their own ways. I think, generally speaking, a lot more focus on the outside world, right, across each of the countries of ASEAN than, I think, intra-block as such. So I think the number of challenges is quite significant, right? When we look across ASEAN at investment opportunities, and we operate in the financial services sector, which is deeply regulated, right? I mean, from our perspective, we could be investing in any country in the world, which is to say that, generally speaking, there's not that much of regulatory harmonization inside ASEAN yet. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is that I think with this tsunami of digitization that we are starting to experience in pretty much each and every sector or industry of the world, I think that is starting to create this secular dynamic of certain degrees of harmonization, right? A really good example of some of this, or one example of this is, right, around cross-border payments, which is still in its infancy, but I think there's a lot of positive talk around how, right, individuals in Southeast Asia can start to travel freely across the region while still using their home bank accounts, right? Without having to do complex and cumbersome money transfers through third-party banks and so on. So look, I mean, I think the challenges are enormous. I think the starting point is very much, I think, the digitization of a lot of different industries and supply chains all the way from front to back. And I think there's positive momentum. But having said that, there's a lot of work to be done before we can talk about one regulatory union.
Okay. Bapak Jerry, you've just come hot foot from an ASEAN Economic Council meeting. What discussions are you having at the regional level to address some of those challenges that Akshay just mentioned and that Rupert just mentioned? And are you trying to draw on examples from elsewhere in the world when you're having those discussions?
Thanks, Chris. I think, you mentioned a lot about regulatory issues, policies, and then collectivity of ASEAN. As we know that ASEAN, one of the principles of ASEAN is that we value and we adore the principles of non-intervention. We value the principles of collaboration among Southeast Asian states, as it was established and it was funded in the very principles of this organization. As I was just finishing my session with the ASEAN Economic Council meeting and also the ASEAN Economic Ministers meeting in Semarang just 10 days ago, we were discussing a lot on how we produce or how we create a very collaborative digital framework collaboration, right? And one of them would be how we maintain and how we preserve the sense or the, let's say, the needs for having a mutual perspective on digitalization. Why? Because it's actually part of our priorities, and we know that, I think as is mentioned by you, and I think all of us would agree that digitalization would create efficiency, practicality, as well as transparency in terms of how to conduct policies and how to conduct license and regulations. As we are witnessing and we are experiencing a lot of challenges in terms of how to conduct policies and regulations among ASEAN member states, I think it would make sense if we made this collaboration even stronger by having a very mutual decisions by establishing a very good groundwork for digitalizations. And I think it's very important. Why? Because ASEAN, as you know, is actually one of the leading regional organizations in the world, right? By size. Let's take a look at other organizations like European Union. I think their population is about 500 million people. And we know that ASEAN population is close to 700 million people, right? And we have this principles called the ASEAN Way, the non-intervention way that I just mentioned to you, which I am quite convinced that it's actually causing a lot of positive impacts on our trade, right? And not to mention that we have this RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, right? That we established a year ago, got being implemented, I think, this year. And this is why we are having a lot of, let's say, potential, so to say, clients, not only from Asia or East Asia or Southeast Asia communities. Yeah. For example, we have the ASEAN plus 3, Japan, China, and South Korea. The RCEP, or we call it RCEP himself, is actually consists of 10 member states of ASEAN and also 5 non-member states, Australia and New Zealand also, apart from Japan, South Korea, and China, because they are very interested in seeing and also in joining ASEAN as a market. Yeah? With a population of close to 700 million people and the GDP close to 11,000 trillion US dollar. Yeah? It's very attractive, right? And also, Indonesia as chairman of ASEAN this year, we are opening possibilities bilaterally with other nations, other states, not only within Southeast Asia, but also out of Southeast Asia, particularly Europeans and also Americans and then other region of the group. And it's true, sometimes policies or regulations can be challenging, but as we know that we are entering the phase of digitalization, I believe, and we always believe, that the program of digitalization, the initiative to digitalize policy can be supporting our efforts and our implementation of our policies. And also, the trade agreements that we have, I think is expanding. Just now, the ASEAN Ministers' Economic Council meeting, we just launched the DEFA. DEFA is the Digital Economic Framework Agreement. It is actually part of our initiative to make a better ecosystem for digital activities within ASEAN. As we know that right now, I think if Indonesians go to Thailand, if they go to Indonesia, let's say we go to Bangkok and then we try to buy things, we have already cooperation with the central bank, our central bank and their central bank, by using QR code. Yeah, we call it CRIS, the Quick Response Initial Code Standard. So if you want to buy things there, you just use your gadget and then you just scan the QR code, less than 3 seconds, and the payment is done. It is part of ASEAN centrality, it's part of ASEAN unity, so that we can have some sort of similar terms and conditions, and also we can have the possibility of enhancing our currency. So not only depending on US dollar. Yeah, it also applies to several countries. With Malaysia also we have, and next with Singapore. So it is part of our integration, part of our unity and centrality that we know it is the competitive advantage of ASEAN as a regional organization. So I think we can talk a lot of things if we want to focus on digital, but I believe that digitalization is something that we must focus now, and something that we should be enhancing, and in a region like Southeast Asia, whereas the countries and all the nations, part of member ASEAN, are growing and emerging, I guess is something that we can also be playing as a strategic role here. Not only in Southeast Asia, but also other regions. As we know and as we are witnessing that other regions, they are very keen in entering ASEAN market.
We were talking in the holding room before we came into this panel, and we were discussing, ASEAN's doing very well, with the good growth rates. FDI is at record levels, and you're outpacing many other countries in the world as well. But you're still really acting as 10 individual countries when it comes to attracting foreign direct investment, rather than collaborating and working together to try and bring it in. And there's still a lack of regulatory harmonization within ASEAN, despite AEC being declared back in 2015. So in your discussions at the AEM and at the ASEAN Economic Council, are you collectively discussing what more we can do together to be collectively more attractive? What more can we do to work on regulatory harmonization?
Yeah, I think that's one of the issues that we were discussing in the session a couple of hours ago, and also a couple of days ago in Semarang during the IM meeting. But we also must realize that in order to have a collective measure, or let's say collective terms and conditions of how we attract investors, how we increase our trade, we must also know that internal stability, and also not to mention the performance of our internal trade must be increased as well, right? And you talk about harmonization, right? For example, in Indonesia, I think it is safe to say that this issue of harmonization is also becoming a challenge. Yeah, and we are working on it, and we are trying to have, let's say, to find a solution. Right? I think some of you might be aware of the existence of ASEAN single window, right? So it's one way of doing things in ASEAN so that we can have some sort of harmonization in terms of policies and regulations for, let's say, a lot of sectors, not only for trade, but also for investment. But before we conclude that, of course, we must have some sort of capacity to resolve our internal issues. Yeah. Like the one that we were discussing just before now. I think we're having this regulation issues, for example, in the Ministry of, not only Ministry of Trade, but other ministries. If you want to issue, let's say, one license, we have to work together with other ministries. We cannot work alone. We cannot work by ourselves, right? For example, one commodity that we issue from Ministry of Trade, we must have recommendations from other ministries, from the technical ministries. It is one way of doing things, and it is by law. So it's something that we must actually do in order to have, another follow-ups or another conclusion to be done. It is actually something, again, that we must share this with other nations or other member states of ASEAN so that we can have the experience, we can share the experience, and we can formulate somehow the policy of, let's say, building collectivity among other nations within ASEAN with regards to harmonization. So I think we can do both in parallel. Yeah, it's not a big deal, but at least we are now starting our initiative to have this kind of consensus. And it is very important. Why? Because as you just mentioned, we can come as one organization. Of course, we can do it bilaterally. Yeah, each member state of ASEAN can do bilateral trade agreements, or we can do bilateral approach. Yeah, it's normal. Yeah, I think all over the world, I think they are doing that. Even in the European Union, I guess they are doing that, right? And it's something that needs more attention, yeah, and more understanding within the members, so that we can move together and collectively finding a solution for this kind of things.
Rupert, I'll come back to you. I mean, SCAT's doing a lot of work with ASEAN, and I'd like you to tell us a bit more about the work you are doing. But what more do you think ASEAN could do as a regional bloc, either at the ministerial level or working group level, to try and drive forward better regulatory cooperation and harmonization?
So SCAP is actually involved in both the investment facilitation side as well as the trade facilitation side, both of which could actually help bolster more regulatory cooperation within ASEAN. On the investment side, for instance, we work through ASEC. So as a mechanism itself, instead of going nation by nation, we are starting with the Coordinating Committee on Investment. That itself says that we want to take a region-wide regulatory harmonization, cooperation sort of approach. What we are considering is a new work program where between the end of this year and sometime next year, we will work with the IPAs of all the member states to identify what are some of the needs that they have. So once we've assessed the gaps, we will work with them to promote capacity building. We're also looking at the value chain within the region in 3 priority sectors: renewables, electric vehicles, and health sector. So in these 3 areas, we hope to work together to see how we can have a coordinated, much more collaborative approach towards investment. So that, I think, would also be a step forward. It would be almost like a piloting to some extent through the capacity building efforts, the needs assessment, and identifying the value chain linked FDI approach. In trade facilitation also, we are doing quite a bit of work. And again, we do work through ASEC and then go down to the national level. Now, because as I said before, trade and investment today are extremely complementary. And in the trade facilitation area, of course, ASEAN member states do very well because as per our UN Global Survey on Digital and Sustainable Trade Facilitation, in fact, this is the sub-region within Asia Pacific. It stands the highest in terms of implementation rate. It's at 81% of across the 31 measures that we cover in this survey. And the Asia Pacific average is around 67 or something. So it's much higher, and it's been improving over time. And nationally, of course, with the single windows, electronic exchange of documents between governments and businesses, the ASEAN single window, which was referred to, there's been a lot of progress. However, we do find gaps even there in agricultural trade facilitation, which was mentioned. So this is an area with, the standards becoming such a big issue in agricultural trade. With integration of MSMEs, there again, there is a lot more scope to facilitate trade and integrate MSMEs into the regional value chains and the global value chains. The third is on trade and gender. There also we find that there is much more scope to actually facilitate trade for women traders. So these are some of the areas that we have identified, and we hope to work further. We do what are called legal and technical readiness assessments of countries to see how prepared are they for digitalization of trade, first at the national level, and then we have the framework agreement on facilitation of cross-border trade, which sits within the UNESCAP Secretariat in our division. And so then we look at leveraging existing national frameworks for digitalization and taking them cross-border. So the ASEAN single window, for instance, how could we look at pilot exchange of documents? How could you bring in more interoperability of documents? So many of the countries, actually several member countries are there from the region. ASEAN, we are looking for membership, because I think this would be a great way for the sub-region to cooperate and sort of build upon the ASEAN single window through the framework agreement. So there are various ways in which we're doing this capacity building, so both trade as well as investment, and we're looking at needs assessment and trying to identify the gaps and then work on those specifically.
Are you actually seeing progress being made? I mean, you mentioned the ASEAN single window. We could have a long discussion about how effective that is and why it takes so long for some of the pilot processes to go through. But as a bloc, are you seeing ASEAN at least willing to make progress on the regulatory harmonization?
There is willingness, but I think what we've also found working with the ASEC, that it works fine, but then finally everything has to go down country by country, and then that is where we face a bit of a problem. So at the national level, there are some countries that have been much more progressive, and we've made progress with them. But getting it across the entire, it's as was mentioned, it's like 10 different countries. And so the ASEC process goes only up to a point. Ultimately, we have to just do it nationally. So yes, so I think there's still maybe a mindset issue or something which is preventing further progress on regulatory harmonization and cooperation.
Akshay, I'll come back to you. Harmonization in the goods sector is hard enough. I think the financial sector is perhaps even more difficult. Again, you're very heavily regulated as a sector. What advances have you seen in the region? Bapak Jerry mentioned the QR code for peer-to-peer payment. That's been actually quite a big advance this year. So what beyond that are you seeing, and what things would you like to see happen?
Yeah, look, first of all, I think, again, just coming back to that point about the fact that there's a lot of work to be done, but you cannot look down on the good work that's happening, right? And I think the QRIS harmonization, QRIS interoperability is a fantastic example. It is unthinkable that this would have happened 5 years ago, frankly, right? So it's quite amazing it's happened. Now, in terms of what else are we actually seeing? Look, I think my worldview, if you will, is limited to financial services, right? I can't think about an objectively speaking, I can't think about a regulation that has been harmonized across the region. But having said that, there is certainly starting to be conversation amongst regulators in the region to come together and learn from each other, which is a very important step in the first place, right? A few years ago, Indonesia was the first country in ASEAN to create a regulation around peer-to-peer lending. I think this was a phenomenon that was taking the West by storm, right? Indonesia recognized the opportunity, in the peer-to-peer sector, or recognized the potential in the peer-to-peer sector to essentially, create a degree of financial inclusion for its unbanked and underbanked that had been very hard to capture in the past. And not only did they become the first regulator in the region to create a landmark regulation, which has, as a matter of fact, right, made a very tangible impact in the world of financial inclusion. But what it's really done by virtue of Indonesia taking leadership and the regulation actually creating impact is created this conversation amongst other regulators in the region to actually learn from Indonesia, right? Now, have the regulations been harmonized yet? Well, I think there's still some ways to go. But the very fact that regulators in the region are starting to talk about Indonesia as the leader in this segment, right? We were in Vietnam recently meeting with the regulator, and they mentioned that they're actually planning on making a trip down to Indonesia, or I can't remember now if it's the Indonesian regulators that are visiting Vietnam, but it's really a joint learning session across the two of them, right? So I think, there are green shoots that are actually appearing. I think that's a very positive step. I do also think that there's, potentially a very important role for industry bodies to play, not just in the financial services sector, but across different industries. There is generally across a lot of ASEAN nations, historically a place for industry bodies, right, which serve as an interlocutor between the regulators and the industries themselves. I think those bodies have an incredibly important role to play, taking best practices across the region, sharing them with the regulators, and vice versa. So I think some of this is starting to bubble up. I mean, a lot of it is below the surface, but it is certainly starting to happen, Chris.
And I'll stay with you. Bapak Jerry mentioned today that the ministers have signed off on the commencement of a negotiation for a digital economy framework agreement. That agreement will look at things like data flows and data governance and consumer protectionism and e-commerce issues, and will clearly touch on fintech. You mentioned the capacity for fintech to help bring people in who are unbanked or uninsured into the more formal sector. This is a bit of an unfair question for you, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. Regulation versus innovation. How much regulation would your sector want, and how much is too much to stop you from innovating?
Well, I don't think it's an unfair question at all, actually. I think, in my mind, right, I think it's a very simple balance that any industry in any innovative sector, whether it's financial services or energy or you name it, right? I think in any industry, you've got to watch that balance between regulation as well as innovation. I think regulation exists for a reason, and I think it's very important to recognize that. It exists to protect, in particular, the weak, right? And that was why, generally, I think, regulation started coming up, even as a concept historically, right? I think any innovative industry needs to watch that balance. Now, for a fact, I think if an industry were to be unregulated, and I think the best example of that is, for anyone here who played around with any cryptocurrencies last year, you know exactly what happened with that. So I think the proof is in the pudding. And I think at this point in time, no one in any industry will be arguing against the role of regulation, right? So I think we're very comfortable with that. And generally we feel that, look, I think while, at a day-to-day level, there might be this tendency or feeling amongst innovative industries that the regulators are slowing you down. I think when you take a step back, generally speaking, I don't think there's been a single instance, at least in our operating history as one of the most innovative financial services companies in Indonesia, that we've actually felt that the regulators had anything other than the greater good in mind. So I think it's our responsibility to watch that balance, and I think the most innovative companies do watch that balance very well.
Thank you. Bapak Jerry, it's going to be very similar to the earlier question. I mean, my personal view is ASEAN as a group could be doing so much better if you just worked closer together. Now, you mentioned the RCEP agreement, which is actually an extremely good trade agreement linking you with other dialogue partners. Very, very good. Do you think that can be a driver to help push ASEAN together to work more as a collective? Again, earlier we were talking about the example of, if you want to get involved in global supply chains, these are complex supply chains. Indonesia doesn't have everything that's needed for an electric vehicle, neither does Thailand, neither does Malaysia. Perhaps if the three of you work together, you might attract more investment in that sort of space. So what more can you do?
Thank you, Chris. Always interesting, to answer this question. A lot of people are asking me this question. I believe that right now, ASEAN is attractive already, right? And as we are adopting the RCEP agreement, which is going to be the second largest bloc after WTO, right? In terms of size and volume, right? And the one who is initiating this is actually ASEAN. It's an organization. It's not a single country, but it's ASEAN. And if you take a look at ASEAN's existence, you also realize that our organization is quite stable, right? Compared to the other organizations, right? We do not have internal conflicts, right? And we do not have conflict among other members or within the ASEAN. And it's important. Why? Because in order to invest, in order to do business, trade, you need stability. And I can assure you that ASEAN is one of the most stable place to invest. And with RCEP, as I mentioned to you, it is the second largest bloc in terms of volume and size. And the non-member states Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and China. They are entering our market. They are doing business with us. They are also investing within ASEAN, bilaterally as well as regionally. I think it is showing, it is sending a very positive message to all countries, right? Of course, we can do more, right? And as we are now doing our digitalization projects, our agreements are on how to build a very ground framework for digitalization, I think it will make ASEAN more attractive, right? Right now we have, just I mentioned to you, the agreement with Thailand, with Singapore and with Malaysia with regards to the electronic payment and digital payment. I think we can have more with other countries within ASEAN and with non-ASEAN member states. I was just in Japan and South Korea a couple days ago, and we were also discussing about the possibility and then, the potential on how Indonesia, as one of the members of ASEAN, can cooperate together with the central banks of South Korea and Japan. They are looking forward. They are very much interested in doing so because they know the size and volume and the potentials of Indonesia as chairman of ASEAN. As you know, ASEAN is not only providing access and market, but also providing potentials for playing a very strategic roles in geopolitics. In terms of stability, again, in terms of how we increase our leverage, I think ASEAN can be used as a tool and can be used as a facilitator, whenever we want to do, let's say, relations with other nations, without or with bilateral working arrangements. So again, of course, we can do more, but what we are doing right now is already attracting a lot of players, a lot of stakeholders, and also when we were in Semarang, we were having this ASEAN Economic Ministerial meeting. One of the participants at the time was India. And although India is not part of the RCEP, there was some dynamics when we were processing the RCEP establishment. But India was actually looking forward to having more collaborations with ASEAN. As you can see, if China, India, and the other big nations are joining ASEAN, it's not as a member, but as one of the participants or active participants, observers or any kind of things, I think it will increase not only leverage, but also the bargaining position of ASEAN as one of the leading regional organizations. So I am convinced, and I always believe that one of the key of solving, global issues is that we should have more integrity, we should have more unity, we should have more centrality within the regional organization, as we know that interdependence is actually growing. You cannot live by yourself, you cannot live only depending on how you make bilateral relations with other countries, but you must also have your utilizing, you must also have capitalizing and also using your own existence as part of a regional group, and in this case, it is part of ASEAN.
You mentioned about ASEAN being attractive. No, I personally would never question that. I think all the fundamentals are there in terms of growth, in terms of population and the demographic dividend and et cetera, et cetera. And I said earlier on, you're doing very well on FDI attraction. I mean, your largest source of FDI, by the way, is the US and then Europe, both outside of RCEP. And you also said, we're very attractive, but we can do more. So why aren't you doing more?
I don't think we have enough time to discuss about that, but again, one of the key is collaboration, right? And you can compare to other organizations, other regional organizations, whereas their way of doing things is different, right? And in this opportunity, I would like to say something about how we should coexist, peacefully as nations, as states. because you're from the European Union, so I would love to see your reaction after this. If we talk about policies, we must talk about the issues of, let's say, standardization, right? And the issue of objectivity or neutrality or the principle of fairness, I would say, right? This is the more attractive part is coming in. As a regional organization, ASEAN's never done such policies that is biased, right? We value the importance of, being objective. We value the importance or the necessity of being fair, right? And we actually are representing not only the voice of the developing nations, but also developed nation. As you know that one of the members of ASEAN is considered as developed nation. And yet, we are not claiming our understanding or our perspective of one single policy to be enforced in other conditions or other region. That is very important. Why? Because, I cannot say names, but one of the regional organizations, they are doing such policies that is very biased, I must say. That is very, I would say, not really objective, if I may, Chris. Yeah? For example, on the issues of deforestation, that regional organization or those countries, they are applying some policies or some laws that are prohibiting some of the products of some nations or some states, including Indonesia, so that some of our products cannot enter European market. Right? I think this must be resolved. And I also remember when I was head of delegation in 2020, back in 2020, I was head of delegation in suing the European Union at the time. Why? Because our CPO, our crude palm oil, was being treated discriminatively. Right? We were discussing and we were talking and we were, having some disputes. And we took this to WTO. Because this is our right to exercise our right, again, as a sovereign nation. Because we feel that it is very important for one policy to be executed fairly. Right? As we were debating and et cetera, at the WTO session, I remember, I was asking why you are discriminating our product. They were talking about environmental issues. They were talking about, being green and so on. And I was asking one of the countries there, I cannot say name.
Oh, you can.
They were saying, you are preserving less of your areas of forests, right? And then I was looking at the data and I was responding to them. I said, okay, let's look at the numbers. How much you are preserving your forest? How much we are preserving our forests? It turns out, Chris, they only preserve less than 20%, whereas Indonesia preserving more than 51%. So now you talk about environmental issues to us. It's not fair. And as we observe deeper and deeper, it's not about environment. It's about price. It's about competition. It's about how our products and their products must compete each other. There's nothing wrong with competition, But you cannot say you use other reason, other environmental issues in order to avoid competition. That's not fair. It's something that we must take our voice, we must stand up. And with regards to being attractive, ASEAN's never conducted such biased policy like that. We always respect others' commitment, others' internal policy, and we maintain collectivity. That's the difference. So, Chris, I apologize if I may say this bluntly, and as we are running out of time, But ASEAN, again, as a regional organization which consists of Indonesia as now is chairman, we'll make sure we're not going to do that. We always respect other sovereignty, we will always respect other voices, and that is making us more attractive.
So, as the moderator, I get a right of reply. The right of reply being, well, I don't work for the European Union. I represent European businesses, and you see me in action at ASEAN meetings, and I'm quite tough on ASEAN. I'm even tougher on the European Commission, particularly on this topic. And I was at a meeting recently, and I can tell you one senior official in the region described things like deforestation directive as protectionist policies dressed up as sustainability. And we could have a long discussion about it. But I must say, I have a lot of sympathy for what you just said. We are out of time, so I will very quickly ask Rupa and Akshaj to give me 30 seconds. What would you like to see happen in the region to promote greater regulatory cooperation to drive in even more investment? Rupa?
That's a tough one in one sentence. I would say having a vision, of a collective vision of where each country has its own competitive advantage and can therefore collaborate. I would also say greater complementarity across policies, so there's coherence, because nothing stands alone in today's world. So as I kept saying, trade, investment, mobility, regulatory cooperation across multiple sectors and issues will be required. So that's the collective.
I don't think I can say anything that would be half as insightful as Rupa just did. I think I completely endorse what she just said.
Right, thank you to my panel. ASEAN is a great place to invest. It's a very attractive place. I love being here and doing business with the region. So please, you got any money? Come and invest it, particularly here in Indonesia. Thank you very much. Thank you, panel.
Please give another big round of applause